Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 324. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And I'm back to back with Mr. Josh Kintanon in Wentworth here, second week in a row. You're setting a streak here, man. How's it going?
You know, I love the sound of my own voice, so every opportunity to talk is one I'm going to take. I am doing great. Elbow surgery recovery is still proceeding apace. I don't actually get to start rolling until beginning of February, so I don't know where that's going to be in relation to when this episode gets released, but ideally I will have been back rolling by the time people are hearing this. But yeah, things are going well.
Awesome. Well, in the last episode, we're joined by Jesse Walker, and we talked about how to run a collaborative camp based on some of the lessons we've learned from doing this for a few years now. And at the last camp, one of the things that you and I were talking about, and we realized we got to make an episode on this, is the idea of social contracts, kind of the unwritten rules that we set with each other when we train jiu-jitsu, even when those rules aren't really rules and you don't really have to follow them. And how do you go about breaking those? And should we break those? And how do you identify those? Because there are so many things. Refresh my memory. I think where this came up was there was a lot of discussion at the camp about grabbing people by the head. That was one place where I remember this came up. And a lot of people they wouldn't do it. They weren't comfortable cross-facing or grabbing people on the throat and framing there. And we realized, well, part of this is because it has a connotation, right? I mean, and it's kind of funny because in jiu-jitsu, we try to choke each other unconscious.
Right. It's considered super mean to like put your forearm across somebody's throat in guard and lean on it, right? That's mean. But if you spin around and get on their back and take your forearm and jam it into their throat, well, that's just a short choke. They can tap if they want to, right? So the exact same thing is happening, guys. Exact same thing. But one of those, you'll get asked a billion times, or you'll see on Reddit, is this a dick move? This guy did this to me. It's like, dude, no, it's in the rules. You can do, it doesn't mean it's a good idea, but he can do that to you. And it's just slightly mean. But why even is it slightly mean? Well, because I feel like it was mean. Well, why? I don't know. And it's one of those things that kind of gets into your head. And a lot of it, I think, is legacy from before people did jiu-jitsu. When you're a kid, when you're growing up and like you do something to your little brother that's mean and you get told it's mean and not to do that. And you get it into your head that things like that are mean. Because I don't know how you guys interacted with y'all's little brothers, but putting my forearm in my little brother's throat was definitely something that I did repeatedly. So you learn that those things are not nice and you're not supposed to do them. But even when you get into this other context of jiu-jitsu, you carry those with you. And a couple of different places that we ran into that was just like applying force in ways that wasn't a clean technique from the perspective of the person doing it, right? Like it wasn't like, oh, you're doing this to do a scissor sweep. You got to put a little effort into it to do your technique. It was just like their head's pointing this way and it would be better if their head were pointing the other way. So just grab their head and make it point the other way. And people did not interact well with that because it felt mean. And there are a lot of other places that don't necessarily feel mean, but where we have this established mentality of what role we're playing in jiu-jitsu. And this isn't to say that all social contracts are bad, because I think we should back up for a second and like kind of talk about some of the general social contracts that we have in jiu-jitsu and why they may or may not exist and why they may or may not be good or bad before we kind of get into the technique ones, because a lot of them are terrible. They've been sort of brought in from the sort of pseudo mysticism of martial arts culture as presented to the Western world via kung fu movies. And that's really where a bunch of this shit maps from. And so you have things like bowing to all the upper belts and not asking upper belts to roll and giving way to upper belts, in various scenarios that creates this like culty culture. And a lot of that filters down, and you get some of these things that like, it's not a spoken rule, it's not a written rule, but you get this idea, this impression that you're supposed to behave a certain way in these schools, and it feeds into some of the cult mentality that we've seen before, and it feeds into a lot of the things that we actually talked about in the last episode about collaborative training. It feeds into a lack of collaborative training, where you've created this environment where only the black belt guy knows everything, and like the social contract is you don't ask other people for guidance. Like that's a thing that exists in gyms, is that it's not a written rule. You can only ask the black belt for help. But if they see you asking for help from somebody who isn't them, they'll come down on you for it. And that's a dumb thing. Why is that a thing? But it's a thing that exists. And that's, I think, probably the first place where you start to see warning signs about your gym is who you're allowed to ask for guidance from.
Well, let's maybe take a second to talk about the idea of a social contract. What do we mean when we say there's a social contract? Like, what exactly is that? And maybe what are some examples of how that looks in real life and in jiu-jitsu?
Because it's an unwritten, implicit agreement about how people are going to behave in a certain scenario. Having grown up in the South, one of those things is something like I open doors for women, because that is a thing that I was taught is correct behavior. There's no law. There's not a law in Georgia that says you got to open doors for women. There's not a rule. It's not written anywhere. And like the closest you'll get to having been told that is like your grandmother telling you it's polite. But it's become a thing where like, yes, that is an expected sort of behavior interaction. And it's less common now than it used to be, but it's still a thing. And that's one of those, it's unwritten, it's undiscussed. If it happens in public randomly, nobody's going to be like confused about what happened, because it's a thing that everybody kind of knows. Even though nobody sat down and said, hey, Josh is going to open a door for you if you get to the door, right? He's going to open the door, right? That's not a thing that's been told to people, but it is a thing that they understand is the way that interaction is going to happen. And you see that on, just a lot of places. And I have been admittedly mostly a hermit for like the past 5 years or so, ever since the gym opened. I only go, like I leave the house to run to the store real quick, and then I come back and go to the gym. So Steve may have to list some more social contracts for the real world, because I no longer have to follow any of them because I don't interact in the real world anymore.
Well, I'll give you a relevant podcast discussed example before. Beatrice Jin, Barambozo, one of the top-ranked women in the world at black belt, longtime friend of the show and sponsored athlete. You know her very well, and you've actually been instrumental in coaching her whole way up the ranks. And
I'll take it, but instrumental feels like a strong word to be throwing in there.
I feel like she was going to be great no matter what. But
I was helpful.
Yeah, but something that she has said, because she's done these episodes with us on how we should stop being nice when we train jiu-jitsu. And this is something that has really resonated with our audience, because almost everyone struggles with that. And something that she specifically said was that as an Asian woman in a male-dominated combat sport, she comes in with a very different life experience, right? I mean, I'm also part Asian, right? And so I can tell you that there's aspects of that culture that are very communal and non-combative, and you're not really encouraged to just get up in people's face and tell them how much they suck. You're kind of expected to handle things politically and quietly and help people save face and do things for the good of the group. And when that's been your entire lived experience, you come into jiu-jitsu and now it's just you versus another person, and you got to choke that mofo out, right? That is a very different experience, and you have to at some point learn to put aside all of these social contracts that you learn to be a good adult citizen, because when you're in a jiu-jitsu match, those don't apply. And now that is just kind of a broader, more philosophical example of a social contract, an unspoken agreement. More specifically, one that I always love to bring up is when you look at junior people, and when I say junior, I really mean like purple belt and below. Sorry, purple belts. But when you look at more junior people, a very common mistake they'll make when they're starting a match is one person will sit down on the ground and the standing person will literally just walk right into their guard and let them set up whatever guard they want, and then they'll go from there. Why do they do that?
We did talk about that. Yeah, we talked about that specific one at the camp where people were just doing that.
Yeah. Now, why do we do that? Trained behavior. It's because if you are training in a classic jiu-jitsu gym that is very based on positions and techniques, you were probably taught that there are these guards and you spent a lot of time practicing those, and you started practice by just letting them set up their guard and working from there because that's how that style of teaching works. But at the end of the day, you start to ingrain that behavior. And so when you see a person sitting on the ground, your trained experience is, well, I should just walk into their guard so we can do jiu-jitsu. No, you shouldn't. The worst thing to do is to walk into the guard. You should try to do whatever you want to do without getting into their guard at all. Getting into their guard and then trying to pass from there is like driving your car into a ditch to see if you can get out of it, right? Don't go in the first place. And that's a social contract that no one ever sat down and explained this to us, right? No one ever said, if you see a human being sitting on the ground, you must wander into their guard and let them get their grips. That was never told to you by your teacher. But the training and the behavior that we watch and see other people do, we emulate it. And of course, because we want to be good training partners, we let them set their grips. And next thing you know, this is a habit that we've built without even realizing it. So that's an example of a social contract. If you want to talk about like quick hit wins that you can use to make your jiu-jitsu way better, not letting people get their grips, not letting them set up their guard on you and just attacking right from the go, that is one of the best hacks for almost everyone at all levels if you want to get better faster, to break that social contract with yourself and with the other person.
And it's the other side of that is the other thing that will make you immediately better at jiu-jitsu. So like, we're just going to dive into all the jiu-jitsu ones now because everybody knows what this is. All right. So the major social contract that we are now going to be breaking is the social contract that we've made with our partner to do jiu-jitsu. We're not going to do any of that now, right? Just like Steve said, don't walk into their guard. If you walk into the guard, now you're doing jiu-jitsu with them. Why would you do that? You don't want them to do any jiu-jitsu. We're going to break that social contract immediately, and we are not going to go into their guard. We're going to start passing from the outside with whatever grips we can get, and we're going to make them figure something out before we ever actually engage their guard. And then from the other side, if you're on the bottom, don't wait for them to walk into your guard. Just stand back up. Dude, if you start standing back up every time you get swept or something and you just get up, you will shortcut so many people's brains that they just won't know how to interact with you anymore. Just like, don't accept the sweep and get up instead. And because I see tons of people that halfway through a sweep, you see the moment where they give up and just go to guard, because that's the deal we've all made. Okay, I was on the bottom. I started a sweep. It was pretty successful. We got to here. Now it's my turn to be on top. So you're going to play guard, right? And we do that. We all have done that. They started sweeping. Oh, I guess I'm on bottom now. And then you start playing guard. And that's terrible.
I've heard Stephen Kesting talk about this and how because we tend to think of jiu-jitsu as this family of a handful of positions, if you adopt that kind of classic way of thinking of jiu-jitsu, you've got, stand up and you've got guard and you've got side control, half guard, knee on belly, mount, back control. That's jiu-jitsu for you, right? And we spend all of this time training in those positions to the point where we forget the space in between. So a very common mistake, like you said, that people often experience is when they are defending from bottom guard and the person starts to pass, at some point they will just yield and they'll just say, okay, well, let's go do side control now, right? And part of the reason is because people train side control, so they're comfortable in that position. A lot of gyms that are position-based don't train that space in between. So people aren't comfortable, scrambling up against a knee cut or dogfighting from there. They're not comfortable fighting in between the positions. They're more comfortable waiting for the person to pass to go to side control because, I'm familiar with this and I can defend from here. And again, That's kind of a social contract. If you do that, if you ignore the space between positions, you actually ignore your best opportunity to make stuff happen in jiu-jitsu.
A thing that I'm fond of saying is that jiu-jitsu happens in between those positions. If you're in a position, you're there. Jiu-jitsu has already happened. The jiu-jitsu happens when you go from one of those like static named things to another place. Jiu-jitsu is what's happening in the middle there. If you're not paying attention to that stuff and doing that stuff, you're not really doing jiu-jitsu. You're just like going from position to position and hoping that your partner lets you do that, which many of our partners will, because they've been conditioned by the way that our training paradigm has been, that that's the way the game is played. And that's why I also absolutely fucking hate the jiu-jitsu is chess analogy, because that implies taking turns. That implies that I do a thing and then you do a thing, and then I do a thing and then you do a thing. And that is the exact opposite of how you should be doing jiu-jitsu. If you want to win a game of jiu-jitsu chess, just take all your pieces, slap your partner's pieces off the board, and just put them there and say, I win. Why? Because that's what jiu-jitsu is. I prefer the StarCraft analogy, right? Zerg Rush. Your opponent should never get a chance to play the game. And that, again, you're going to violate somebody's social contract if you play that way. Because, and especially poor lower belts, good God, man, if, again, it's social contract here, you're supposed to let lower belts work. This is an idea that is ingrained into kind of all of us the moment we hit blue belt, usually. Sometimes before then, which is even worse. But like, you get this idea that you have a technical advantage, you have a skill advantage, you have, sometimes it's also told to people who are bigger, like you have a size advantage. You should be letting other people, the people below you, you should be easing off and letting them work and giving them a chance to try and stuff like that. And I disagree with that. I think, and I teach my students, that you should punch down one level as hard as you can. So blue belts, if you're rolling with a white belt, fucking work them. Don't give them a chance. You're not injuring them. You're not ripping submissions, but give them nothing. Take it all away from them. Sweep them, smash them, progress through your positions, submit them, give them nothing. Because as a blue belt, most of the people that you can actually try your offense on and get, practice at your game, most of those people are white belts. You have some blue belts at parity that you might be able to get good reps on, but a lot of times you guys, you're at parity, you're just smashing against each other. You're not really getting those reps in, because the white belts should be your drilling dummies. You should not be flopping to your back and then just like playing with their guard passing or something. Don't do any of that. That's for purple belts. The purple belts can do that for the white belts. Why? Because they're going to be punching down as hard as possible at your blue belt ass. You're going to get fucking wrecked every time they touch you, ideally, right? So that they can run their game on you, and then they can let the white belts work. And then you as a blue belt, when you roll with the brown belts and the black belts, they're going to let you work. They're going to give you some time. They're going to give you looks and options and stuff and so on, right? At purple belt, most people should be coming after you, right? The brown belts should be punching down on you. The black belts let you work a little bit, but whatever. And then that's the way it should be going, because letting people work is fine, but you can't let everybody worse than you work, or you don't ever get any real good practice. And that's one of those, I think that's probably one of the most damaging social contracts that is embraced by the hobbyist practitioners. Because if you watch the top level teams, the training footage from them, like B team and stuff, those guys, none of them give a shit about each other. They're falling on groups. They're throwing each other on top of other people. They're smashing relentlessly. They're just not giving, like, their partner, they're not letting their partner do shit. That's the way a lot of their training is. But in our hobbyist gyms, where you're just chilling and doing, there's not as much of that. We care about each other's safety in a way that those top level competitors don't. That's just the way it is, because you have to train like that when you're training at that level. You just can't always be worried that somebody else is going to get injured, because you have to be training at a higher intensity. So somewhere along the way, if you actually want to get better at jiu-jitsu, you have to throw away that courtesy. You have to violate that social contract of letting the people below you have a chance to work and play and do. And you just have to worry about yourself and be selfish and smash those people.
Yeah, that's a great point, because something that many people worry about is, am I being mean when I do this stuff? Am I being a dick? People in jiu-jitsu are, and this is a good thing, right? They're worried about whether they're being too aggressive or too dangerous, and that's understandable. But there is a difference between showing sport appropriate, I mean, I would call it being assertive rather than aggressive, right? But there is a difference between showing a sport appropriate level of assertiveness versus being mean. You mentioned on Reddit, the constant threads about, is this a dick move? I just saw this the other day where someone was asking the exact same example you brought, forearm in the throat. People at my gym are telling me this is bad. Why is it true that it's bad? And my answer was, well, I mean, it depends what you mean by bad. If by bad you mean, is it effective or not? There's a time and a place for a forearm in the throat, but there's definitely times when if you do that, you open yourself up to things like arm drags. So it's situational. But is it bad in terms of, is it dirty? No, absolutely not, right? I mean, some of the finishing moves that you will do in the sport to end a fight involve forearm in the throat. I don't see why it's meaner to put someone's forearm in the throat from like half guard just to hold them there. I don't see why that's meaner than doing a bread cutter. I mean, in terms of what's going to do more damage, it's going to be the bread cutter, but we consider that choke to be a foundational jiu-jitsu choke that everyone does and no one has an issue with. And I mean, again, you hear this a lot when people talk about, the big thing that I've heard a lot is people saying that windpipe chokes are dirty. And I really thought that at this point in time, the sport would have moved past that understanding, but people will say, well, they're mean and they're not effective and there's a high risk of injury. And I mean, my thought is like, look, it's possible that you could crush someone's trachea with like an Ezekiel choke.
That is way fucking harder than people think it is. Like infinitely more difficult.
Yeah, but I mean, people do have strokes, right, from a rear naked choke. I don't understand why we feel it's dirty to put pressure on your windpipe, but me cutting off blood to your brain until you go unconscious, and possibly suffer a stroke or die, that's totally clean. Right? This in a lot of ways is jiu-jitsu propaganda. And we've seen this, I think, steer the sport. And oftentimes we don't question those decisions enough. An example I always give, right, is for years, I've been talking about how people should work turtle. And everyone talks about how turtle is garbage, blah, 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 blah. And I've always said, well, look, I'm not saying
turtle is garbage, guys. It is.
I'm not saying that you should make turtle the basis of your game. But what I am saying is that the main reason I think people feel that way is because under IBJJF rules, if I get on top from guard, I get 2 points. If I got on top from turtle, I do not. So the rules have created this perpetual cycle. Now that you see no-gi, ADCC, CJI getting more popular, suddenly learning turtle is tremendously important because there's this much bigger emphasis on wrestling. And so, I mean, it's not that turtle was ever really that bad, but it's just that the rules of our sport created this social contract by accident where people just started thinking guard is good. That's the true authentic jiu-jitsu. Turtle is this ineffective thing. Nobody does it, right? And I think there's a lot of situations like that in jiu-jitsu where moves, I mean, leg locks, another great example.
Yeah, for the longest time, the social contract was leg locks are a dirty technique. They aren't real jiu-jitsu, and we don't do them. And that's like, they eventually codified that one into the rules, like that. At first, that wasn't a rule. There was no like written thing that said leg locks are illegal. That didn't exist. Right? Like when they were doing all those Vale Tudo showdowns and shit in Brazil, it wasn't like they weren't allowed to do leg attacks. But in order to discredit the opposing jiu-jitsu group that did do a lot of leg attacks, this propaganda was distributed that said leg locks are for dirty, poor people. Only the poors touch people's feet. And it created this contract, the social contract where they all agreed they weren't going to be foot touchers. They weren't going to use those techniques, even when they competed against each other, right? They just kind of stopped doing that. And then it was eventually codified into the rules themselves that they were illegal. But it didn't start out that way. It was just, no, we don't like them because we don't like those people. We're all going to agree not to use those. And we've kind of done the same thing with stuff like punch chokes. A punch choke where you grab somebody's gi and you tripod up inside their guard and put your fist in their throat and put all your weight on it, that shit will work. It will. If your partner is not good enough compared to you to disrupt that base and get your pressure off of their throat, you can sleep them with that. But if you ask people, is a punch choke a dirty move? Is it okay if I do that? a whole bunch of people will be like, yeah, that move is really dirty. You can't do that. Don't do that. That's mean. That's mean to do. Save that for competition. We hear that a lot. Save that one for competition. Save that behavior for competition, which we know is a stupid time to try something that you have not been practicing regularly in the gym. And that leads to, I'll talk with the waving instead. That leads to this scenario where you're told, well, don't do that in the gym. Save it for competition. And then you get into a competition and you have an opportunity and maybe you try it. You do it because you're like, now I'm supposed to be mean. And because you never fucking do it in class, it doesn't work right. You get your back taken or you get snatched up in an armbar and you're like, oh, well, this doesn't even work. And then you don't do it anymore. And so we've gotten rid of now the mean technique because, oh, well, it's not that it's mean, it's that it doesn't work. And then some judo black belt tripods up on your throat and puts you unconscious because they didn't get the fucking memo that that doesn't work. Like nobody told them you can't do that. So they just did it to you because they have base and posture and structure that you can't beat because nobody in your gym does that either because it doesn't work. And now you don't know how to do anything about it and you're unconscious. And that's the kind of thing that you can have accidentally build by creating these social contracts to be nice to each other in training in ways that it's not like it's avoiding injury or anything. Those don't lead to more injuries. It's just people don't like it happening to them. And so we've all kind of agreed not to do it, which has resulted in people not being able to do those things well, which has resulted in them not working, which has resulted in coaches saying, well, it's not that it's mean, it's that it doesn't work. Just do something, don't do it. It doesn't work. Do something different. Do the real way because this way works and that way doesn't, and also that way is mean and people won't like you if you do it. But if you put time into them and learn how to use them the way every other control grip and control position is, then they start working. That forearm and the throat grip can be incredibly useful and strong and controlling and force people to deal with it. There's a bunch of other stuff. We talked a lot about misaligning the spine at this past camp in one of the sessions. Misaligning your partner's spine is some of the meanest shit you can do to them. And it is also one of the most effective things you can do in jiu-jitsu to make your jiu-jitsu work. If your opponent's spine, if their structure from the tip of their head to the tip of their toes is all twisted up like a fucking, you're wringing out a towel, they won't be able to do anything to you. But it feels incredibly mean. And if you are new to the sport and you start bending somebody's ear to their shoulder while you pull their knees to their chest sideways, you see the look on their face and you're like, oh, that's really mean. Maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe we shouldn't do that to each other. I'll be nicer than that. And it creates that environment. And is that necessarily bad? I don't know, but it definitely makes you worse at jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great example. I mean, twisting the spine, right? Breaking someone's posture, breaking their alignment. That is one of the most foundational things to do in jiu-jitsu. And to someone who doesn't train, it sounds incredibly mean, right? I'm taking your head and I'm twisting it in a different direction from the rest of your neck. But that's just part of how the sport works. To some extent, if I want to do jiu-jitsu against you, I have to be a little bit mean because I have to take your body out of its natural alignment. If I am afraid to do those mean things, like I'm afraid to twist your head so you're not facing me, I'm denying myself to do the foundational things in jiu-jitsu that make everything else effective. So it's a great example of, again, that social contract and how we train ourselves about what's good and what's bad. And much of it is just rule-based propaganda, like you said. I mean, at the camp, what was his name again? Andy. Can we give his full name? We should give this guy a shout out.
So it's Andy. He teaches at Hybrid Martial Arts. I cannot pronounce his last name, but I'm going to try. Give me just a second.
Well, while Josh is looking that up, what I'll say is that this guy ran a session at our camp called The Meanest Shit You've Ever Seen. And I went into this thinking, whatever, bro. I've seen some mean shit. I've been doing this for 16 years. You're not going to show me anything I haven't seen before. I'll say, coming out of that camp, it was the meanest shit I've ever seen. There's no question. But what especially stood out to me with Andy's session was that pretty much everything that he was showing, although just incredibly mean to look at, most of it was IBJJF legal. There's no rule saying you can't do it. He was showing all sorts of ways to, clap the person on their face and twist their neck and crank them under their nose and things you can do to get their teeth into the choke and, legal ways to fish hook without putting your fingers inside the person's mouth, but to just basically do a claw against their cheek. And most of it was completely legal. But I think most people would agree it's mean as fuck.
People were appalled by that. They were appalled by that session. But 95% of the stuff was totally legal.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting that in the gym you should be doing all of this stuff with the intent to hurt your opponent. But the reality is, and I think what that session illuminated for a lot of people is within the context of what we already consider to be legal and fine, there's a lot of stuff that people just will not do, even though to some extent, it works, right? If you've never trained against it, it's definitely going to work because you don't know what to do, like you said. And that's where we wind up having these knowledge gaps that people can exploit in our game. If you have spent your entire jiu-jitsu career avoiding something because you've been told it's dirty or low class, don't do it, you're not going to know how to defend it properly because no one's doing it to you.
Right. And that's what we saw the first EBIs and stuff, where all of a sudden heel hooks were a real thing that before like two dudes ever really did those. And then we saw the explosion of the leg lock meta where suddenly, hey, it's no longer a social taboo to do leg locks. Now it's a normal standard part of this jiu-jitsu over here. And we saw a technical explosion in the growth and development of the sport that further led to a technical explosion in guard passing methodologies and stuff that were required in order to deal with these new leg attack metas and stuff. And it's Andy Stolarik, I think is the correct pronunciation. He's always at the camps down here when I host them. I always have him come out. So if anybody wants to see some mean shit, come out to one of the camps and talk to Andy.
I also recorded the session if you want to see it. Holy moly. If you want to know how can you be as brutal within the rules as possible, I mean, I think if anything, it's worth watching that footage just to understand the scope of what is actually permitted under the rules. Because I think it would blow people's minds. People aren't used to training that viciously, but it's completely legal, or at least a lot of it is. And I mean, you don't have to use that stuff against your opponents, but you should at least know how to make sure it doesn't get used against you.
Right. And it just looking at how extreme you can get in terms of manipulating somebody's body within the context of the rules will often make you more comfortable with the less extreme versions of that you should be doing on a regular basis, right? Like, yeah, you don't have to be like cranking their whole head like you're trying to do a movie neck break on them, but you definitely want to be pushing that ear to their shoulder and turning their chin away from you and things like that, and learning that like, yeah, it's a little bit mean, but it should be the expected level of mean that we're all in the gym to experience. You know, you're here to learn jiu-jitsu, which is an art that is based on folding people into uncomfortable positions. We should be prepared to be made uncomfortable. We should be prepared to make our partners uncomfortable. And that should be okay to do. Nobody should be getting mad when this happens. Again, we saw that, oh God. So I think you saw this, the Reddit thread, the Reddit post from some dude, something Wong, I think was his name. And he has this wrestler that was dropping into their gym. The wrestler was being mean, like with some barely collar ties and I think a forearm in the throat. And the dude like dove on a heel hook and cranked it. And like, why are you mad? Why was this dude? He's like, dude, you're a black belt or whatever. How are you mad at somebody playing ever so slightly with more physicality than the standard jiu-jitsu game? And that was a clear scenario where the wrestler broke the social contract. He didn't break any rules. He wasn't injuring anybody. He was not doing anything that would have made somebody in my gym look twice. We wouldn't even have blinked at it. But it was definitely violating the jiu-jitsu social contract for like how intensely you're rolling a little bit and like the collar, like how you're engaging, because he wouldn't engage in the guard, right? That was, I think, what made the dude mad, was that he refused to just walk into this guy's guard for the longest time. The guy had to go chase him down and like get an entanglement, but he injured the guy, or at least attempted to. I don't know how injured the guy actually ended up being, but he definitely was just like ripping a heel hook on this dude because he was mad. Like, why are you mad at that? And that's a problem when our social contracts get violated in a way that makes us mad and go injure somebody, even though the social contract that they violated didn't result in anybody being in danger of injury. Like that's a problem with this social contract that we are operating under, and that needs to be revisited.
Yeah. Now, something else that you talked about earlier, I think it's great to bring this up. You talked about negative jiu-jitsu. And man, this could be a topic for a whole other episode. How to do jiu-jitsu that is focused on making sure that they can't do jiu-jitsu. That is a great example of violating the social contract because, again, when we train, we kind of get into this habit of walking into our opponent's guard, just letting them do their thing and letting them work. And for skill development, I totally get that, right?
Right. There's a time and a place for that, for sure.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, if you want to actually be effective, you want your opponent to do as little jiu-jitsu as possible. So a big part of that means not engaging. If you look back at the earlier days, not the super early days, but I guess maybe second or third generation of the UFC, where it started to become a real sport, where MMA became like a real discipline, you would see a lot of these guys where as soon as it went to the ground, they would just back up and walk away. Why engage? Why play into their strongest suit, right? And in jiu-jitsu, of course, that's one option. You can always back up and walk away. But even if you don't want to do that, there's a lot of things you can do to play anti-jiu-jitsu, just not letting them get any movement off, not letting them get anything. A big part of why it's so important to win the grip fight is because they really can't do jiu-jitsu if they can't grip onto you somehow. So if you are always trying to win the grip fight and you're never letting them touch you, it doesn't matter how good they are at jiu-jitsu, they won't be able to do anything. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this social contract that we sometimes break, which is how do we refuse to let the person do their jiu-jitsu against us?
Yeah, this is the overarching social contract that we all enter into when we step onto the mats, is we're all going to do jiu-jitsu together. I'm going to do some jiu-jitsu. You're going to do some jiu-jitsu. We're going to do some jiu-jitsu. And again, there is a time and a place for that training paradigm to be like that collaborative, I'm learning, you're learning. That's usually that's during the drilling process for us, right? As we get it, because our drilling isn't static. We're doing dynamic drilling. So your partner is giving you some resistance, but they're letting you succeed in varying degrees. So for me, that's the drilling period. When you get into the rolling period, our collaborative process is over. Now it's conflict. So now you're trying to do your jiu-jitsu to me. I'm trying to do my jiu-jitsu to you. And we're both should be trying to prevent each other from doing jiu-jitsu to us, right? So, but oftentimes you fall into the idea of we're doing jiu-jitsu to each other at the same time in this sort of enmeshed jiu-jitsu thing, right? It's like, it's my sweep versus your pass. It's like I'm going for this submission and you're working to escape, and like we're doing these mutual actions together. And when we talk about negative jiu-jitsu, it's usually the way that I teach my MMA fighters to do jiu-jitsu, which is to disallow as much movement as possible from your opponent and then to disengage immediately whenever your engagement is symmetrical. So if you have options and they have options, get out immediately. If they are able to move and do things to you, stop their movement immediately. They shouldn't get to move, and the engagement should be asymmetrical in your favor when you make it. And what that leads to is a lot of, say, pinning somebody in bottom of guard until you can back out, and then starting to pass. And every time your pass starts to go a little sideways, you just back out again and start passing again. And people will get mad. They will get upset. They will get frustrated, especially when you watch my fighter who just got his blue belt. In his white belt competitions in jiu-jitsu, you can see his opponents getting very frustrated because he does not do jiu-jitsu. He doesn't do jiu-jitsu when he does jiu-jitsu competitions, right? He is approaching to establish his dominant grips and execute his technique and get the takedown and then stay there and not let them do anything. And so if he takes grips and they get some kind of grip, he'll strip grips and reset if he doesn't like what happened. And he'll just make them do it again and again and again and again and again until he gets what he wants and can then execute. And that is that's mean to do. An emotional standpoint to your training partner in the gym, you're not letting them play any jiu-jitsu. You keep coming in and starting to do jiu-jitsu, and then when they try to do jiu-jitsu back at you, you leave. What a jerk. Except that's the correct way to do jiu-jitsu. You don't just go in and let people do stuff to you. You go in and you try to get your dominant connections. And if you don't get your dominant connections, you leave and then you try again. That's the game. That's the idea. But we've kind of, I don't know if we have come away from that. Like we've gotten, as the sport has gotten more inclusive and we've gotten away from the idea that everybody's trying to be an MMA fighter and you're all going to be tough as nails and we're going to pour 1,000 people into this meat grinder and we're going to get 5 dudes out of the other end. Like we've gotten away from that idea and into more of like a real sport that has a real hobbyist population that is not trying to meat grinder each other. They're not out here to just get beat up. They're not trying to do those things. And so the training environment has gotten more cooperative. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It is okay for that to be the way you train, as long as you are happy with the way your training is creating your jiu-jitsu. But what I ran into, this is a trap. I'm going to warn all you the purple belts. This is pretty much universally a purple belt trap. This will fuck your head up if you let it happen. This happened to me at purple belt. I started relaxing in all my roles and like letting people work. And then that started to become an excuse. I was getting pieced up by these like kind of athletic blue belts. And I was telling myself, well, it's only happening because I'm not really trying, right? I'm letting them work. I'm letting them work. I'm letting them work. Yeah, he only got that because I let him get there. And that got in my head. And I realized that I had stopped progressing in jiu-jitsu because I just had gotten into my head that I was letting these people work and that's why they were having success. And it was a ego protection mechanism to stop me from having to suffer the blow to my confidence, the blow to my ego of having an athletic, bigger than me, younger than me blue belt actually successfully like pass my guard and choke me. And have to deal with the fact that I needed to bring my skill level up and figure out how to resolve that, right? I fell into that trap. And it's really easy for that to happen at purple belt because of the social contracts that are around letting lower belts work. And the idea that we're doing this sort of collaborative training together where we both do jiu-jitsu and you can fall into that and it can then damage your jiu-jitsu. So yeah. There you go. Don't let that happen to you, purple belts. Stay toasty, on your toes, get after them blue belts, smash them, don't give them anything.
That's a great point and something that I think we all run the risk of falling into, because if we want to be good training partners, there is a time and a place, like you said, to let people work, but that doesn't mean that you just don't do your own jiu-jitsu. I've seen sometimes, especially with bigger people, this tends to happen because they get it trained into them that you've got to be super gentle and nice to the little people, to the point where sometimes they're almost afraid to engage. And I've had this where I'm sparring with someone who is much bigger than me, and I know they're very skilled. They're not going to hurt me. I'm not worried about that because we're talking about like a black belt, but they're afraid to engage with someone who is smaller because they've been trained out of that. And so they will kind of just sit there and do nothing. And all of us can run into this situation where we dial back on our jiu-jitsu to let the other person work because we are all understandably told from day one, don't be totally crazy out there. Don't be aggressive. Don't be dangerous. And so one of the things that you often have to do with a white belt is kind of dial them back a little bit, right? But the problem is, at some point, you don't want to be dialed back too much. And after a year or so of training, you can get yourself into the situation where you're so dialed back that you're just always going super slow and you're kind of afraid to engage. And yeah, in those situations, you have this built-in excuse where if you lose, you can say, oh, well, I just wasn't going 100% because I was there to learn and this guy was clearly here to fight. And I mean, sometimes that's true, right? Sometimes you get an awful training partner who's just there to scrap. But even if you're there to learn for skill development, you have to be pushing the pace, trying to advance the fight, right? You can't just be sitting there trying to let the other person work all the time. The fight, like you said, is not like chess. It's not like I take a turn, you take a turn, I take a turn, you take a turn. We're both at the same time trying to push our objectives forward. And if your jiu-jitsu doesn't look like that when you're sparring, you're not really getting the most out of things. Again, I think that's another social contract where understandably we tell people, take your foot off the gas a bit. You don't want to be going 100%, especially when you're a white belt. That's great advice. But by the time you get to purple belt, you should be able to keep up a pace and keep trying to push the fight forward without putting yourself or your training partner at any major risk. And so for me, that was a big retraining I had to do. At white belt, like everyone, I spent the first 3 stripes just getting told to settle down and not be an idiot. But around purple belt, my coach started telling me, like, Steve, you're not even trying. You're just sitting there doing nothing. You're just putting up this like lame defense. And it's just because I'd been trained for so long that you gotta be slow, controlled, relaxed. If you can't do it slow, you can't do it fast, blah, 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 right? And so as a result, I had kind of trained myself to be less effective. So there's a balance, right? For beginners, it might be good advice for safety to tell them to maybe restrict what they're doing. But you got to take those handcuffs off at some point if you want people to start being effective. And once they know enough to be safe with what they're doing, yeah, you absolutely want to be pushing the pace.
And it's definitely worse for big guys. This is one of those places where the super heavyweights just get screwed because they're constantly being told that they have to ease off of the little guys, and the little guys are everybody in the room. So you see this a lot in super heavyweights that come from smaller gyms where they're just like, they're the dude, they're the biggest guy in the room and they don't really have anybody else. The only people that can really push them are like, a couple of 200-pound blue and purple belts or something, and then maybe the coach. But even then, that's like, if you're 270, 280 and like 6'4", and then you go to compete and you run into somebody who is your own size and like, you don't even know how to handle that because you've never had to do it. And like, that always sucks for the big guys. So they definitely have to find a way to break those contracts and like really put some heat on people. And again, it sucks because that's also dangerous. The reason that they get told that stuff so much is because that much weight moving at any speed is gonna suck if it falls on somebody. So definitely I feel for my super heavyweight brethren when it comes to like being able to break the social contract and put some more intensity into what they're doing, because the little people on my end of the spectrum, we don't have that problem. We can go absolutely berserker ham on the big people and nobody's really going to say anything to us, and it's fine. But, oh, dang it.
The funny thing is, I know I've said this before, but I have suffered much more and much worse injuries from smaller people than from bigger people. Because the bigger people always have that restraint. It's trained into them. But smaller people, no one ever sits them down and says, hey, just so you know, yeah, you're 150 pounds, you're 130 pounds, but if you throw your entire body weight at someone, that's a large projectile to get hit with, right? And so often when injuries happen, it's not because a big guy pancaked on top of me. It's often because someone my own size tried to do a really aggressive De La Hiva and they kicked me in the knee, or, something like that. Or they tried to do a cartwheel pass and their shin hit me in the head. That's the kind of stuff where I think the injury risk resides. But that's another great example, again, of the social contract. We don't apply it equally because, look, force equals mass times acceleration, right? If you got a lot of mass, you can generate a lot of force. But if you got a lot of acceleration, you can generate a lot of force as well. So be careful with that shit, regardless of your body size. I would also ask, while I have you here, are there any other obvious social contracts in jiu-jitsu that you see which are prime for breaking? I mean, I can talk about one. There's a lot of rituals and traditions that even make its way into the fight. Of course, one of the common ones is at the beginning of the fight, we often slap, or we slap bump, or we bump, or whatever. This can be a disaster because you got to understand, like, there is no rule saying you have to go up and slap bump the person. So if you go up thinking it's slap bump time and they just arm drag your ass.
They just blast W or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, that is completely within the rules.
So that's a specific one that I tell my students. When you go up to compete, you slap bump or shake hands or whatever before the ref says go. If the ref says go and your dumb opponent sticks their hand out, you just blast double them off their feet or whatever, right? That's not on you. The ref said go. The ref didn't say shake hands, right? So if that happens, you just go. Just take them out. No problem. But let's see. What other things, right? So like we've got this sort of like mutual play contract where I'm taking a turn, you're taking a turn, we're both doing jiu-jitsu. You can violate that to just get better practice rounds where you do all the jiu-jitsu and they're stuck just trying to stop you. Great, beautiful. There's the positional social contracts. Things like, hey, I ended up on top Therefore, it's my turn to play top and you have to play guard. You can violate the shit out of that when somebody gets halfway through a sweep and you're like, oh, I'm going to end up on the bottom. Just stand up and leave. Be like, nope, not going to do that. I'm not accepting that sweep. I'm just going to get up. Let's see. There's a lot of just like being nice things where you're allowing people to be comfortable in a position where they have no business being comfortable. If I'm on the bottom of side control and I am like okay with that and don't feel any need to move to a better position, you are not being mean enough to me. Nobody should ever be comfortable under mount or under side control or when you have their back. They should not be resting to gather themselves to figure out an escape. They should be struggling for their fucking lives like they're drowning. That is what you should be striving to create in those positions. But once again, we're too nice about it. We're just chilling. You know, it's like, oh, I got side control. Cool. I'm winning. I'm going to think about my Americana or something here. And then like, okay, they're working their escape. Cool. I'm going to counter their escape and stuff like that. And like, but you're not really doing the things that will keep them from putting together an intelligent escape. You're not jacking their head to the side and twisting their spine and making it uncomfortable for them. You're not really being heavy on their solar plexus or on their diaphragm to restrict their breathing in a way that's going to really put some pressure on them to find a better position to be in. You've backed off into this sort of overly permissive training environment where we're letting our partners do too many things. And again, time and a place. Sometimes that's okay. If you are a 200-pound brown belt and you are working with a 140-pound white belt, absolutely. Let them do stuff. Don't pancake them through the floor so bad that they never come back. But like, if you are working with a 180-pound purple belt, he should regret every decision that he's made that day that brought him into class. He should be like, man, I really should not have had a breakfast burrito this morning because that's going to come up if I'm under this knee on belly for another 2 seconds, right? You should be making people suffer in certain circumstances when you're training. And that's okay. It's totally fine. That's what we all signed up for. Every role is not going to be a chill, pleasant role where you get to do stuff. And we should all be okay about that, right? That should be a thing that we expect. It should be fine. And this is a concern that I get from people when I tell them things like that, right? They're like, yeah, but if all their roles that they have are terrible, then they're not going to have fun and they're not going to come back. Well, you're not all their roles. Some random white belt, their roles aren't going to be just all blue belts that want to murder them. That's not going to be all their roles. They're going to have 2 of those. And then they'll have like a role with another white belt where they get to do dumb white belt shit. And they'll have a role with like a purple belt, and that purple belt's going to let them work. It's fine. If their role with you sucked, that's okay. They can have one. They can have a role every night that sucks. It's fine. They'll get used to it. They will understand it's part of jiu-jitsu because that's what they signed up for. It's what you signed up for. It's okay. Get okay with it and like get out of those social contracts that you brought from the outside about how nice you have to be and reframe everything in terms of jiu-jitsu and your jiu-jitsu goals and how nice do you need to be in jiu-jitsu, because it's significantly less, right? Like, I don't want to see somebody take the point of their knee and jump up in the air and spike it through somebody's chest, right? Like, that's bordering illegal, but I think you could probably do it in a way that's legal, but you're probably going to injure everybody that you do it to. Right. So now we're at a place where like, yeah, we've kind of got a social contract not to do that shit to each other. And it's there for a reason. And don't violate that one. Right. Like this isn't a thing that says all of these unspoken agreements for behavior is all bad and you should just ignore all of them and maul everybody all the time, whether they get injured or not. That's not the conversation. The conversation is look at the things that you're doing and understand why you are or are not doing them with an eye towards the goals of jiu-jitsu. Because the goals of jiu-jitsu involve twisting your opponent into a bunch of uncomfortable places. And if you're looking at a position like you're in top side control and you're like, how could I make my partner less comfortable here without actually injuring them? Start doing that stuff. Just find something that's like, yeah, if I put my hand over his face in a legal way and it's annoying, They have to move. Cool. That's great. I made them move in a way. Is there some way I can capitalize on that? Awesome. Right? Do those things. It's okay. Get it out of your head that you can't do that. And understand, though, they're probably going to do that same stuff to you. And that's also okay. It's fine. You'll live.
Yeah. I think the one last thing that I'd like to just talk about is this concept of a pattern interrupt. So basically, a pattern interrupt is when you do something that is so unexpected and so contrary to people's internal scripts that it just completely breaks their brain and catches them off guard. This can be a tremendously powerful tactic when you're dealing with someone who is clearly just following a mental script. So perfect example, right, is let's say that I'm a telemarketer. I call you, you pick up the phone, I try to sell you whatever the hell I'm trying to sell. You're immediately going to say, what? No, I'm not interested. And you're going to hang up, right? You're not even going to think about what it is that I'm saying. I have zero chance of actually selling to you because you're already running this mental script to shut me down. But if I say or do something really weird or unexpected, then it kind of forces your brain to say, whoa, hold on, stop. This is not on the script. And then whatever is going on in your brain, you've got to elevate up to the actual cognitive level and really think about what I'm saying, right? So if I say something totally insane, you see this a lot in self-defense too, where sometimes people say, if you feel like you're in a real altercation, and I know our friend Jesse Walker has talked about this because he's taught self-defense before, you can do a pattern interrupt. You can say something completely unexpected, like, what does chocolate taste like? People don't expect you to say that when they're about to punch you in the face. And that's going to make people stop and think, well, hold on, what's going on? And that could be just enough of a pause that you can exploit. And you can do this in jiu-jitsu if you can figure out a way to pattern interrupt your opponent, to get them into a mental script and then take them out of it. My favorite way to do this is with something that I've heard Drew Foster call the double tap, which is where you go for a submission on someone. And of course, they're going to get their defenses up, but then you let it go. Like, I don't have it, fine. And they'll put their defenses down. And then you just snap it on again.
Immediately grab it back again. Yeah.
Exactly.
Because they're so relaxed about the idea that they beat that submission, right? That now they just aren't prepared at all. They're like, wait, I won that game. You can't go back and play that same game again. I won that game. And like, that's the thought process that you've now, because that's like very social contracty in that, hey, if I beat your submission, I beat it. You're not going to go back to it because that's the game we were playing and I won that game. You just go right back to it. And it's one of those things where you can just create this moment of mental unclarity, mental chaos. And my personal favorite one is when you just like stand up from the bottom of guard and push someone over.
That's my highest percentage sweep.
Right? It works. So people will just watch you. They will watch you stand up and then they will fall backwards. And now you're just and they just don't do anything to stop you. And they don't understand what happened. And there's this moment, you can just see the gears turning in their head where they try to figure out how they ended up on the bottom. Because it's not an expected thing because of this agreement that I'm on the bottom. So I now have to do these named jiu-jitsu sweeps that involve these grips and posture control and all these things. I have to go through this process that has all these pieces in order to get on top. That's the agreement. I have to build my contraption that is a sweep that gets me to the top. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to stand up and push you over. Boom, mind blown. And there are a bunch of places like that you can find as you play.
Yeah, that is actually one of my favorite things about playing Turtle. Again, I am not advocating for Turtle as an A game, but when you pull Turtle, it breaks people at some fundamental level because they are so conditioned to expect that, well, if I'm standing and they're on the ground, we're going to play guard time, right? They're going to try and sweep and submit, and I'm going to try to pass. And they've got this entire game plan, an entire script that is set up in their head about how we're going to do this. And then if the little fucker on the bottom just curls up into a ball and dies, now the person on top is like, okay, well, everything I thought I came here to do is not happening. So now what do I do? So you get people kind of tepidly come up and they try to grab your collar or something. And inevitably, that mental script in their head is going to kick in, which is like, I got to take this person's back. I can see their back. I have to do it. I have to do it. It's like a freaking magnet. And one of my number one ways for getting on top is I just ball up. I let them try to take my back, and my back defense is probably better than their back offense because I've played so much Turtle. So I'm probably going to wind up on top. And it's not an A game strategy. I'm not suggesting that you should go and try to win tournaments doing this. But it's a hilarious psychological experiment in the gym because everything they thought that was going to go down, none of it happened. we started playing a completely different game. And that takes people so far out of their element that it makes them very likely to make mistakes because now they're off script and they don't know what to do. And people don't like to be off script, right? So that's a great example of a pattern interrupt. And your pattern interrupts in jiu-jitsu don't have to be as silly as, pull turtle all the time. It can be something a bit less dramatic. I mean, even little things like where you're looking at with your eyes, right? The most common way to telegraph your intent as a human being is to look at something. This is white belt advice, right? But if you want to shoot on someone, don't look at their feet. For fuck's sake, look anywhere else but their feet because the other person knows exactly what you're going to do. Unless, of course, you're not going to shoot. You're going to do something else. Then look at their feet all day long because they're going to be expecting the wrong thing. So much of good jiu-jitsu is psychological warfare, right? If you've got a trained opponent and you can take them out of their comfort zone and make them off guard, everything is going to be easier against them because they're no longer in that area where they're strong and they can expect what's going to happen.
That's one of my favorite ones from wrestling is the head tap double, where you just reach out and tap somebody's forehead, right? And you tap and then you shoot behind that masking hand because for people who are at a lower level of wrestling, they haven't had that happen to them a bunch of times. Somebody, you're not in a striking sport. We're not throwing punches at each other. Somebody just reaches out and just bonks you on the forehead, creates this moment of wait, what? And then it's too late because you couldn't see them because their hand was in the way. And them tapping you on the head has created this moment of mental confusion. And then they're on your legs. And that's I teach that to my kids and stuff for jiu-jitsu. And I teach it to my white belts as a way if they like doubles, if they're going to be shooting doubles. It's just this is the most basic way to take somebody down, especially just an untrained person too, it works great on because they expect different things. They just don't expect you to reach out and just bonk them on the head and then go. That kind of thing is that's a pattern interrupt. That's almost breaking the social contract that we're grappling because I've hit you. I didn't actually hit you, but the process that you went through was similar to what happens when you get hit because you got bonked, right? You got touched, you got tapped on the face, and it creates this moment of wait, I thought we were grappling. Well, that was grappling. I just touched you. That's fine. I didn't break any rules.
Yeah, awesome, man. Well, a lot of food for thought here. I hope that if nothing else, this conversation encourages people to really just reflect on everything they do and why they do it, right? There should always be a good reason why you do the things you do, and you should be able to justify it rationally. And I always tell people, if something is so taken for granted that no one even bothers to explain it or talk about it, there's a possibility that there might be something there for you to take advantage of.
It can be exploitable.
Yeah. Or at least to increase your understanding of that area. I put in a newsletter recently that I think one of the most deadly traps that we can fall into, one of the most dangerous words that we can use is obviously. Because once something is obvious, what you're saying is, well, it doesn't even merit discussion. Don't even think more critically. I remember really good brown belt once told me many, many years ago, obviously straight ankle locks aren't going to work against a good opponent, right? Well, look at today, right? Look at what's happening now. Straight ankle locks are the freaking meta. And part of it is because a lot of people just assume this stuff doesn't work. And so the people who did actually study it and try to develop a skill set there, they wound up with such a firepower advantage in that area that, look, if you can get someone in an Aoki lock or a Woj lock or a shotgun ankle lock and they don't know how to defend it, it doesn't matter what they think about ankle locks and whether they work or not. They're screwed, right? So I always encourage people to look at those things that seem so obvious that why would we even talk about those? And usually when you unpack that shit, you find a whole bunch of things that you didn't even realize were the case.
Mm-hmm. And so the other side of that, right? So you've said make sure that there's a reason for the things that you do. Also, make sure there's a reason for the things that you don't do. Why are you not doing something? Why are you not putting your hand in a certain place? Why do you not use a certain grip to control? Know why those things aren't used. Try them. See what happens. See what you can do. Ask explicitly if something is actually against the rules, if it's a thing that you think you could do that would make something work better. Because if it's not against the rules, if it's not actually oh yeah, you're definitely not allowed to do that. Outside toe holds, which are against the rules in everything. It's a great submission, but you are 1000% not allowed to do it. But there's a bunch of stuff that people don't do that's actually allowed. They just don't do it. And so make sure you understand why you're not doing certain things as well. Know why you're doing what you're doing and know why you're not doing what you're not doing. Very important things to know.
Yep. Awesome, man. Well, if anyone wants to benefit from your wisdom, how can they find you? How can they follow you? How can they train with you?
First, I'm going to have to acquire some wisdom. Then I will find a way for you guys to all benefit from it. But if you'd like to benefit from my general presence, wisdom or not, the BJJ Mental Models Discord, available to BJJ Mental Models premium subscribers, is the best way to do that because that's where I hang out all the time. You can also harass me on Reddit. I am user Kintanon, Kintanon. Feel free, talk shit at me. It's fine. My preferred way to interact with people is for them to just come visit me at my gym at Apex Conyers. We are about 45 minutes east of Atlanta. Drop in anytime, beat me up. I don't mind. We also are on Instagram at Apex Conyers, managing to still post my Yeet of the Weeks. We just had a fresh one posted back. Honestly, hopefully there will have been another one posted by the time this episode airs, but we just posted one. So we're trying to be more active on social media. So go watch our Yeet of the Weeks. And I think that's everything.
Awesome. Amazing, man. Well, as I always do, I will put links to that in the show notes. I'll also put a link to our stuff. BJJMentalModels.com is where you can find everything you need. Podcast is free. Mini episodes are free. Newsletter is free. Premium is not. Premium, though, is worth your money. BJJMentalModels.com for more information. Basically, it's a massive content library of audio courses on mindset, strategy, tactics, kind of exploring the stuff we do here that's less technique based. Also, on top of that, you get coaching from folks like Josh. And of course, you get access to our community, which I personally think is one of the best communities online in the sport. Again, all of that's at bjjmentalmodels.com. So please do check it out. Thanks again to everyone for listening. And Josh, thanks as always for the fantastic chat, buddy.
It was a pleasure as usual. I love being on these things.
I know you do. Well, let's do it again, man. Thanks a lot. And to everyone listening, thanks again to you as well. Really love having everyone hang out here every week. I know that there's 800 podcasts for people to listen to, so the fact that people hit play on this one is still something that's pretty cool. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and we'll talk to you next time. See you then.